The man who would change Clara Beaumont's life forever arrived on her doorstep in the middle of a thunderstorm, bleeding from a wound in his side, and barely conscious enough to whisper his name before collapsing across her threshold like a felled oak tree. It was the spring of 1882 in Colton Creek, a small but growing town carved into the red dust of southwestern Texas, where the cattle trails still hummed with the sound of hooves, and the air always carried the faint perfume of cedar and dry earth. Clara had lived alone on her modest homestead for 2 years since her father passed, tending a small garden, keeping chickens, and doing what mending and laundry work the townsfolk brought her way. She was 26 years old, with dark chestnut hair that she kept pinned sensibly at the nape of her neck, and brown eyes that noticed everything. She was not a woman who startled easily, but the solid thud of a grown man hitting her porch floor in the pouring rain gave even her steady heart a lurch. She crouched beside him immediately, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his throat and feeling the pulse there, strong but rapid. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed in trail-worn clothing that had seen better days. His hat had rolled off somewhere in the mud. There was blood soaking through the left side of his shirt, and she could see it was not fresh, that he had been riding with this wound for some time. His face, even slack with unconsciousness, was angular and weathered in the way of men who spent most of their lives outdoors, with a jaw that carried a several days' growth of dark stubble and deep-set eyes that flickered behind closed lids. "Lord have mercy," Clara said to no one in particular, because it was just her out here, and she was going to have to handle this herself. She got his arms over her shoulders, braced her knees, and used every bit of strength her practical, farm-hardened body possessed to drag him out of the rain and through her front door. She left a trail of mud and diluted blood across the floor she had swept that very morning, and she did not spare a thought for it. She wrestled him onto the narrow cot near the back of the main room, the one her father had used during his final illness, and set about cutting away the fabric around the wound with her sewing shears. The injury was a knife wound, she determined, deep but not into anything vital from the look of it. He had been lucky, or perhaps he was simply too stubborn to let a knife kill him. Clara had learned a good deal about wound care from her father, who had kept a well-thumbed medical text on his shelf alongside his Bible, and from old Doc Abernathy in town, who had patched her up after a horse threw her when she was 19, and had talked through every step of what he was doing, saying that a woman living alone ought to know these things. She cleaned the wound with whiskey from the bottle she kept for exactly such purposes, stitched it closed with the small, neat stitches of someone who had spent years doing fine needlework, and bound it tightly with clean linen. The man groaned through most of it, and at one point his hand shot out and gripped her wrist with startling force. "Easy," she said firmly. "I am trying to help you." He released her slowly, his fingers going slack, and he drifted back under. She sat back on her heels, breathing steadily, and allowed herself a moment to simply look at him. He was probably a few years older than her, she guessed, maybe 30 or 31. His hands were calloused and rope-scarred, definitely those of a working cowboy, but there was something in the quality of his clothing, in the good leather of his boots, that suggested he was not simply a drifting ranch hand. She found his saddlebags near the door where they had fallen with him, and she searched them practically, looking for anything that might tell her who he was and whether she needed to go for the sheriff. She found a money belt with a considerable amount of cash, a folded document bearing the seal of the Colton Creek Land Registry Office that she did not read beyond confirming it was a legal document and not a wanted notice, a clean folded shirt, ammunition, and a small leather-bound journal that she set aside without opening. There was no wanted poster in his things. There was no badge either. She found a name, finally, tooled into the leather of his saddlebag in the manner of a man who had owned that bag for a long time. Colton. J. Colton. She made a note to send word into town in the morning if he worsened. Then she banked the fire, hung his soaked coat and shirt near the hearth to dry, and pulled the ladder-back chair close to the cot to keep watch through the night. The storm rattled the shutters and drummed on the roof, and Clara Beaumont sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened to the stranger breathe. His name was Jesse Colton, and he told her so himself the following morning when he opened his eyes and found her sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, watching him with an expression that managed to be both warm and measuring at the same time. His first attempt at sitting up earned him a sharp reprimand from his own body and a quiet, "I would not do that," from the woman across the room. He settled back against the pillow and looked at the low-beamed ceiling of a home that was clearly loved, if modest. "Where am I?" he asked. His voice was rough with thirst and sleep. "Clara Beaumont's homestead," she said, rising and pouring a second cup. "About a mile east of Colton Creek proper. You collapsed on my porch last night." She brought him the coffee and helped him drink it, matter-of-factly and without any fussing that might have embarrassed either of them. He studied her face while she helped him, the composed set of her mouth, the alert intelligence in those brown eyes. "You stitched me up," he said. "It was not a question." 8 stitches, she confirmed. "Knife wound. You had been riding with it for a while, which was not wise." "No," he agreed. "It was not." He closed his eyes briefly, marshalling himself. "I am sorry to have descended on you like that, Miss Beaumont." "Mrs.," she said, then quickly added, "widow. My husband died 4 years ago before we could get the homestead fully established. My father helped me keep the place on and then passed 2 years since, so it is just myself here now." She did not know why she gave him all of that at once, except that something in his direct manner seemed to invite directness in return. "I am sorry for your losses," Jesse Colton said, and he sounded as though he meant it genuinely, not as a social nicety. "And you?" she asked. "Jesse Colton, from your saddlebag. Who are you and where are you from, and do I need to go tell Sheriff Grady that you are here?" The faintest suggestion of a smile crossed his face. "No warrants out on me, Mrs. Beaumont. I am a cattle rancher. Was for the past 8 years running a spread up near Abilene. I have recently made arrangements to settle in this area." "What kind of arrangements?" she asked, because she was practical and this was her land he was recuperating on, and she deserved to know. "Land purchase," he said simply. "I finalized it last week with the registry office in town." She nodded, accepting this without pressing further, and the subject was filed away in her mind without particular significance. There was land being bought and sold all around Colton Creek these days, as the railroad's westward reach brought new money and new settlers. It was hardly remarkable. "You will need to stay off that horse for at least a week," she told him. "The stitches need to hold and you lost a fair amount of blood. I have a spare room that is dry and the cot is already yours for now. You are welcome to recover here if you have nowhere else." Jesse Colton looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, something between gratitude and quiet surprise, as though kindness from a stranger was something he had not entirely expected. "I would be very grateful," he said. "I will pay you for the trouble. We can discuss that when you are well enough to have a proper conversation," she said, and rose to begin making breakfast, and that was how it started. He was a good patient in the sense that he did not complain and did not make demands, but a frustrating one in the sense that his idea of resting was sitting up against the wall on the cot trying to do things with his hands, mending his own gear, reading, writing in that small leather journal. On the second day she came in to find he had gotten up and was standing at the window looking out at her property with an expression of focused attention, and she told him in no uncertain terms to sit back down before he tore her careful stitches. "Your fencing is down on the north side," he said, not moving immediately. "I am aware," she replied evenly. "I will get to it." "You do everything here yourself." "I manage," she said. He finally turned from the window and looked at her directly, and there was no pity in his expression, which she appreciated, only a kind of respectful acknowledgement. "I can see that you do," he said, and sat back down. They talked during those first days the way people do when they are thrown together unexpectedly, and the normal social choreography of gradual acquaintance is bypassed entirely. She brought him his meals and he thanked her properly each time. And the conversation began to stretch and deepen in the way conversations will when two people find that the other one has something genuinely interesting to say. He told her about Abilene, about the long cattle drives he had ridden in his younger years before he had saved enough to buy his own land, about the brutal summer of 1880 when a drought had nearly broken him, and he had held on through sheer bloody-mindedness. He told these stories without self-pity and without boasting, in the straightforward manner of a man reporting facts, and Clara found she liked listening to him very much. She told him about her father, a schoolteacher from Ohio who had caught the westward fever in the 1860s and brought his young family to Texas with a wagon full of books and absolutely no practical knowledge of frontier life, and how they had learned together, the whole family, laughing at their own mistakes and quietly mourning the ones that cost them. She told him about Thomas Beaumont, her husband, who had been a gentle and decent man taken by a fever in his second winter, before they had known each other long enough to have built anything beyond hope. Jesse listened the way good listeners do, without interrupting, without pivoting to his own experiences at the first opportunity, and when he spoke in response, it was clear that he had actually heard her. On the fourth day he was moving around well enough that she let him sit on the porch in the afternoon sun, and she brought her mending out there, and they sat in companionable quiet watching a red-tailed hawk riding the thermals over the mesquite flats to the south. The air smelled of warming earth, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark was performing at full volume. "You love this place," Jesse said. It was not a question. "Every inch of it," Clara said, not looking up from her work. "My father and I built the chicken coop together. Thomas and I put in the kitchen garden. The elm tree at the back I planted that the year my father passed to have something living to look at." She paused. "It sounds foolish, perhaps." "It does not sound foolish at all," Jesse said. "It sounds like home." She looked up at him then and found him looking back at her with an expression she could not quite name, something earnest and a little cautious at the same time. She dropped her gaze back to her mending, and felt a warmth in her face that she attributed firmly to the afternoon sun. On the fifth day she changed his dressings and was pleased to see the wound closing cleanly with no sign of infection. Her hands were efficient and careful as she worked, and she had done it enough times now that it was no longer awkward, or it should not have been. But today, for some reason she could not quite account for, her awareness of the physical reality of him was more acute. The warmth of his skin under her hands, the way he held himself very still for her, the slight controlled tension in his breathing. "Does it hurt much still?" she asked, to say something practical. "Less every day," he said. His voice was quiet. She finished rebandaging and straightened up, gathering her supplies, and when she turned to go he said, "Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name, and it stopped her in the doorway. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for the doctoring, for talking to me like a person." She looked at him over her shoulder, and whatever careful composure she had been maintaining cracked just slightly at the edges, enough to let something soft and genuine show through. "You are a person," she said. "That has not required any particular effort on my part." She went back to her kitchen and stood at the window for a long moment, looking at the elm tree her father would never see grown to full height, and allowed herself to feel what she was feeling, which was something she had not felt in a very long time. On the sixth day she drove the wagon into town for supplies, leaving Jesse with strict instructions to rest, and she made her customary rounds. She stopped at Hartley's General Store for flour and salt and lamp oil, exchanged the news of the week with Mabel Hartley, who knew everything and everyone in Colton Creek, and was just heading back out to the wagon when she nearly collided with Tom Reardon, who managed the land registry office. "Mrs. Beaumont," Tom said, steadying himself and tipping his hat. "Haven't seen you in a while. How are things on the homestead?" "Well enough, Tom, thank you," she said. "Busy time of year." "I expect you'll be getting a new neighbor shortly," he said conversationally, leaning against the post in that way he had when he had something he found interesting to share. That property east of yours, the Henderson parcel, old Henderson finally sold it last week. Didn't want to before, you know how he was, but the price was right apparently. New fellow from up Abilene way bought it. Young man, came in very businesslike, knew exactly what he wanted. Clara felt something shift very slightly in her chest, like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. Is that right? She said carefully. Cash purchase, Tom said, with the particular admiration of a man in the land business for a cash transaction. Signed and sealed. Fellow named Colton. She stood on the boardwalk of Colton Creek with the afternoon sun laying long gold bars across the dusty Main Street, and she thought about the folded document she had seen in Jesse's saddlebag, the one bearing the seal of the land registry, the one she had set aside without reading. She thought about the way he had stood at her window looking north, saying her fencing was down. He had not mentioned it, not once in 6 days of conversation, not through all their easy talking, had he mentioned that he had bought the land directly beside her own. She drove home with something she was not quite sure how to name sitting in her chest. It was not precisely hurt, because why should it be? He owed her no particular disclosure. They had met as strangers under extraordinary circumstances and had spent less than a week in each other's company. But it was something. Something that had more weight to it than logic quite accounted for. She unhitched the horse and put away the wagon and brought the supplies inside, and Jesse was where she had left him, sitting on the porch in the late afternoon light, and he looked up when she came around the corner with a genuine smile that she was honest enough with herself to admit she had been looking forward to seeing all the way back from town. She set her basket down and stood looking at him for a moment. Tom Reardon at the land registry sends his regards, she said, watching his face. Something shifted in his expression, a subtle realignment, and she saw him understand what she was saying. Ah, he said. The Henderson parcel, she said. Yes, he said. She sat down in the other chair, folded her hands, and looked out across her land, which ended where the Henderson parcel began, separated only by a weathered fence line and a stand of cedar elms. When were you going to mention it? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, and she respected that he did not rush into an excuse. I was not sure how, he said finally. The first night, obviously I was not capable of explaining much of anything. And then the more time passed, the more I felt like the timing had become strange. I was afraid you would think I had some purpose in being here that I did not have. And what is your purpose? She asked. To settle, he said, to build something. I bought that land because it was good land, good grass, good water access from the creek. I did not know who lived next to it. I did not know anything about you before I fell on your porch. He paused. Clara, I need you to know that. She turned her head and looked at him, and she believed him, which was the thing that mattered most in the end, because Clara Beaumont had become very good at knowing when she was being lied to and when she was not. I do know that, she said. It just surprised me. I am sorry for the surprise, he said quietly. A silence fell between them, but it was not an angry silence. It was more like the silence after a difficult piece of music resolves into its final key, a little breathless but fundamentally settled. So you will be building a house, she said, and a barn, eventually. It will take time. It always does, she said, and picked up her basket. Supper will be ready in an hour. She went inside and stood at her stove and felt the complicated interior, whether of a woman who had been alone long enough that the idea of not being alone was simultaneously wonderful and terrifying. She stirred the pot and watched the steam and let herself think about a future that she had stopped allowing herself to imagine. The next morning she checked his stitches for what she told herself would be the last time, and declared him fit to travel if he chose, though she recommended another few days of care. He thanked her with a seriousness that communicated he understood the full weight of what she had done for him, and then he surprised her. I would like to stay, he said. Not as a patient. I will sleep in the barn if you prefer, but I would like to stay a little longer if that is not unwelcome. She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved, which was the length of time it took to draw a steady breath. You can stay in the spare room, she said. "It would look peculiar if the whole town thought I had been housing an injured man in my barn." The corner of his mouth turned up, and she looked away before it could turn into something she would have to think about for the rest of the day. He stayed. He stayed through the rest of that week and into the next, and it became clear almost immediately that Jesse Colton's idea of not being a patient was to make himself useful in every way he could without overexerting himself to the point where she would have to scold him. He mended the north fence, working steadily and methodically in the mornings when the air was still cool. He split a cord of firewood that she had been meaning to get to for weeks. He fixed the latch on the barn door and replaced 2 rotted boards on the porch without being asked, having identified them in his first week of convalescence. She watched him work from her kitchen window with more frequency than she found strictly comfortable to acknowledge. In the evenings they sat on the porch with the cooling air coming off the hills and they talked, or they did not talk, both being comfortable enough with silence by now to know that it was a different kind of intimacy than speech, and in some ways more honest. He had a dry, understated humor that appeared when she least expected it and made her laugh in ways she had forgotten felt so natural. She discovered he played harmonica badly but enthusiastically, and she told him so, and the expression on his face at being told this plainly was so genuinely delighted that she found herself laughing again. She lent him books from her father's shelf, and in the mornings they sometimes discussed them, standing on opposite sides of the kitchen table with their coffee. He read carefully and thought carefully and had opinions that were his own, not borrowed from whatever the prevailing wind was, and she found this more attractive than any amount of handsome face or broad shoulders, though those were not, she was finding, without their effect. One evening about 12 days into his stay, they were sitting on the porch watching the last of the sunset burn itself out across the western sky in shades of deep orange and violet, when a rider came along the track that passed her homestead heading toward town. The man slowed as he passed, tilted his hat to Clara in the way of someone who knew her, and looked at Jesse with undisguised curiosity before riding on. "That was Cal Ferris," Clara said. "He will have told 3 people about seeing you here by the time he reaches the saloon." Jesse looked at her carefully. "Does that concern you? In a small town it is simply the nature of things," she said. She paused, though it may occasion some conversation. "Clara," Jesse said, and the way he said her name had developed a particular quality over these weeks, a kind of care in the handling of it that she felt in the region of her sternum. "I should say something." She waited. "I am not a man who is good at this kind of thing," he said, and there was something in his voice that was unusually unguarded, a roughness that was not the wound. "I have spent most of my life being very straightforward about what I want when it comes to land and cattle and business. But this," he said, and he stopped. "This," she prompted gently. He turned to look at her in the dimming light, and what was in his face was plain and real and a little frightened. "I find that I am in no hurry to leave," he said, "and I am very much aware that my reasons for that have nothing to do with my land next door." Clara looked at him for a long, honest moment. The sky above them had gone from orange to a deep bruised purple, and the first stars were coming out over the mesquite, and the air smelled of evening grass and cedar. She had been alone for a long time, and she had been fine with it. She had made her peace with it and built a good life in that solitude. But sitting here beside this man in the gathering dark, she could no longer pretend with any conviction that she wanted to be alone. "I find," she said carefully, "that I am not in any hurry for you to go, either." He did not reach for her hand or move toward her, but the quality of the silence between them changed completely, became something full and warm and freighted with possibility. They sat in it together as the stars multiplied overhead, and Clara thought that this was the beginning of something, and felt that thought with a kind of reverent terror. The following week Jesse rode over to his new property for the first time since his injury, and he asked Clara if she would like to come. She stood at the fence line between their 2 properties and looked out across the Henderson parcel, which was rolling grassland with a good creek threading through the south end, and a stand of big live oaks that would be perfect for shade near a house site. It was beautiful land, she thought, genuinely beautiful, and she felt a complicated mix of things. Awareness that this would be her neighbor's land, that whatever grew on it would shape the view from her own windows and the nature of her daily life, and something else, something warmer about the person who would be building here. The house should go there, she said, pointing to the high ground near the oaks. You would get the breeze in summer and the shade in afternoon, and you could see the creek from the porch. Jessie stood beside her, and she could feel the warmth of him close in the late morning air. "That is exactly where I was thinking," he said. She glanced at him and found him already looking at her, and whatever was developing between them had grown substantial enough now that looking at each other directly had a weight to it, a gravity that required acknowledgement. "You will need lumber," she said. "I have put in an order at the mill in Archer Falls," he said. "It will take a few weeks to arrive. I thought I would begin clearing the building site while I wait." "I can help on the days I have time," she said, before she had fully decided to say it. His expression did something complicated and then settled into something warm and simple. "I would like that," he said. They began working the land together in the mornings, and the physical reality of shared labor created between them a different kind of closeness than the evening conversations on the porch. There was something deeply honest about working beside another person, about seeing how they handled difficulty and fatigue and frustration, about the wordless communication of two people doing something physical together. Clara had always found that she trusted people. She had worked alongside more than those she had only conversed with. Jessie was tireless in a measured, patient way, not the reckless energy of someone trying to prove themselves, but the steady endurance of a man who understood that good work was done slowly and correctly. He asked her opinion on things and listened when she gave it, which she found more notable than she should have, because she had known too many men who asked only as a form of courtesy and had no real interest in the answer. The townspeople noticed their growing acquaintance, because of course they did. Mabel Hartley gave Clara a significant look the next time she came into the general store. Doc Abernathy, who had known Clara since her riding accident at 19, stopped her outside the church one Sunday and asked after her new neighbor in a way that communicated a good deal more than the words themselves. Clara handled it all with composure and a certain private warmth that she kept carefully inside, because she was not yet certain enough of things to let them become public. What she was certain of was the way she felt when she heard his horse coming up the track in the morning. What she was certain of was the quality of the quiet between them when they were working side by side in the field, how it felt like something she had been missing without knowing it. What she was certain of was that she had started sleeping better since he came, which was a fact she found both revealing and somewhat alarming. The lumber arrived from Archer Falls on a Wednesday in late June, hauled in on 2 freight wagons. Clara drove over with her own wagon and helped stack and sort it, and Jessie's expression when she arrived with her sleeves rolled up and ready to work made her feel something that she had stopped being careful about feeling. Several men from town came out to help with the initial heavy work of setting the foundation piers, which was the custom in the area, neighbors helping neighbors with the large tasks, and Clara worked among them as equal to any, which some of the men found surprising and most found admirable. Jessie watched her with those eyes that held everything carefully and said nothing unnecessary, and she was aware of his attention the way you were aware of sunlight, as something warm and sustaining, and occasionally almost too direct to look at straight. In the evening after the work, a few of the men stayed and someone produced a jug and someone else had a fiddle, and they sat outside in the golden evening with the smell of new lumber all around them. Jessie found himself standing beside Clara at the edge of the informal gathering, close enough that their arms were nearly touching. "Thank you for today," he said quietly under the sound of the fiddle. "The town helps each other," she said. "It is how things get done out here." "I know," he said, "but you especially. You have been here from the beginning of all this, and you have been," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "generous." She looked up at him, and the word between them carried a great deal more than its literal meaning, both of them aware of it. "You have been worth it," she said simply. The fiddle player struck up something faster, and one of the older ranchers grabbed his wife's hand and pulled her into a clear space for dancing, and several others followed, and the evening became something joyful and easy, the particular generosity of people who lived hard lives celebrating small good things together. Jesse held out his hand to Clara. She looked at it for the length of a heartbeat, and then placed her hand in his, and the expression on his face when she did that, the quiet, unguarded gladness of it, was something she was going to carry for a very long time. They danced in the Texas evening with the stars coming up and new lumber stacked around them and the smell of cedar in the air, and Clara felt something in herself that she had thought was finished unfolding like a flower that had been waiting for the right season. She laughed at something he said and felt his hand sure and warm at her waist, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her with its simplicity, that this was the kind of happiness that did not announce itself in grand moments but arrived quietly through a series of ordinary ones, each one compounding the last. The house went up through July and into August, and Clara was there for much of it. She had her own homestead to tend, her chickens and garden and the late season preserving that occupied serious time, but she moved between her place and Jesse's with an ease that became natural as it would have been between any two neighbors who had become friends. She brought lunch sometimes, and he brought it to her in return on days she was working on her own land, and the meals became an occasion for conversation that stretched well past any practical requirement. He was building something good, she could see. The house was solid and well-proportioned, 2 rooms down and a sleeping loft, with a deep porch facing the oaks and the creek view she had recommended. He planned a proper barn to follow, and then a bunkhouse when he was ready to take on hired hands, and she could see in the way he talked about it the long vision of someone who was planning to grow something permanent here, not a man who was passing through. He had brought a small herd up from Abilene, 8 good cattle settled on the land, while the construction continued, tended in the rough pen he had built first. She was helping him move them one afternoon in mid-August, when one of the steers made a sudden break, and she was on it before she had consciously thought about it, turning the animal back with a practiced ease that came from years of managing livestock alone. Jesse was watching her from horseback with an expression she had come to know, that particular blend of admiration and something warmer that he made no particular effort to conceal from her these days. "Where did you learn to work cattle like that?" he asked. "Same place I learned everything else," she said. "Necessity," he laughed, a full genuine sound that she had been collecting like a kind of treasure. "Clara Beaumont," he said, in the tone of a man taking stock of something important, "you are unlike anyone I have ever met." She was very glad she was facing away from him at that moment, because the smile that came to her face was not one she was prepared to share quite yet. It was too large and too unguarded, and it told far too much. That evening, she was walking home along the fence line between their properties in the blue dusk when he caught up with her, having left his horse at his barn. They walked together without planning it, as had become their way. "I want to ask you something," he said, when they were about halfway between his house site and her fence line. "Ask it," she said. "I have been thinking about this for a while," he said, "and I am aware that I am not particularly elegant with words when it matters, but I would rather be honest with you than eloquent." He stopped walking, and she stopped too, facing him in the failing light. "I came to Colton Creek to start a new life," he said. "And I have been doing that, building the house, getting the land ready. But somewhere in the last weeks I have started to find that the thing I am most looking forward to each day is seeing you." Clara's heart was doing something it had not done in years, a kind of sustained, trembling high note. "I would like to court you properly," Jesse said, "if you would allow me that privilege. I am aware that we began under rather unusual circumstances, and that I have been your neighbor before I have been anything else. But I am asking now, clearly and honestly, whether you would let me be something else as well." The evening star was out above the hill to the west, and the crickets were beginning their nightly declaration, and Clara stood in the warm August dark and looked at this man who had arrived bleeding on her porch and had, in the space of a few months, become the most important person in her daily world. "You may court me," she said. "Jesse Colton." He exhaled slowly, and she saw in his face the relief and the gladness of a man who had not been entirely certain which way the answer would go. "Thank you," he said, and his voice carried everything the words were too small to hold. They stood there a moment in the settling dusk, neither one quite ready to move away from this moment, and then she said, "You should get back before it gets fully dark. That new porch step you put in is not set yet." He laughed again, and she walked the rest of the way home in the dark, feeling like the ground beneath her feet was somehow more solid than it had been that morning. Colton Creek was a small community, and the nature of a small community was that nothing in it went unobserved or undiscussed for long. Clara was well known and well liked in the town, and the fact that she and the new man on the Henderson parcel were becoming close had been observed by enough people that it had made its way around the general social circuit without anyone needing to be particularly deliberate about it. She was aware of this, and Jesse was aware of it, and what she appreciated was that he did not treat this as either an embarrassment or an undue pressure, but simply as a fact of life in a place where people were genuinely invested in each other's affairs. He came to church with her on Sundays, sitting 2 spaces down in the pew in a way that was perfectly proper and somehow unmistakably warm, and he drove her home in his wagon afterward, and the drive became the best part of the week. On one of those Sunday drives in September, when the first real coolness of autumn was coming into the air, and the light had turned that particular slanted gold of early fall, he pulled the wagon up to her gate and helped her down as he always did, and this time when her feet found the ground and his hands were at her waist, he did not immediately release her. He looked at her, a long and direct look that held everything, and she looked back, and the moment stretched until it was absolutely clear what the next moment would contain, and when he leaned down and kissed her, it was gentle and certain and exactly right. She had kissed men before. She had been a wife, however briefly. But this particular kiss, in the September afternoon light beside her gate with his hands still warm at her waist, this one felt like a first in some essential way, like the first real breath after a long time of breathing shallowly. When they parted, she looked up at him, and his expression was serious in the best possible way, the seriousness of a man who understood the weight of things and did not treat them lightly. "I have been wanting to do that for quite some time," he said. "I am aware," she said, and went inside, and allowed herself to stand in the middle of her kitchen with her hands pressed to her cheeks like a young girl. Autumn came in fully through October, and the work on Jesse's ranch continued. The barn framed and roofed before the cold set in, the small herd increasing as he bought additional cattle from a rancher south of town who was scaling back. Clara watched the place next door transform from raw land to something that had the beginning shape of a real working ranch, and she felt a complicated pride in it, as though its success was partly hers, which in a small way it was. They were together most evenings now, one of them going to the other's place or meeting on the fence line with their horses. The courtship was not formal in the elaborate sense some people maintained. Clara was too practical for that, but it was genuine and attentive, characterized by the particular depth that develops between 2 people who have already been through the foundational honesty of crisis together before they were through the pleasantries. He brought her wildflowers once, a handful of late-season blooms he had found along the creek, and handed them to her with such a complete absence of self-consciousness that she laughed, and then felt immediately guilty for laughing. And he laughed too, and said that he knew it was not much but that he had thought of her when he saw them, which was the most perfect thing he could have said. She gave him her father's copy of the cattle management manual that had helped her through her early years on the homestead, with notes in the margins in her father's neat hand. And the way Jesse received that, with a kind of reverent care for the object that recognized what it was, made her feel that she had been right about him from a very early time. In November, a difficulty arrived in the form of a man named Harlan Weeks, who appeared at Clara's homestead on a Tuesday morning with a hat in his hands and a proposition on his lips. Harlan was a widower of 50, a moderately successful dry goods merchant in Colton Creek, who had taken an interest in Clara for the past year, and had several times made his interest known in ways she had deflected as kindly and clearly as she knew how. He was not a bad man, but he was persistent in the way of someone who was accustomed to commerce and believed that most things were ultimately negotiable. He sat at her kitchen table and told her that he was serious in his intentions and that he could offer her a comfortable life in town, away from the hardships of working a homestead alone, and he said all of this in such a reasonable and well-meaning tone that she felt sorry for him even as she knew her answer. "I am already being courted, Harlan," she said plainly, "and I am not of a mind to be courted by anyone else." Harlan's expression clouded. "That rancher next door," he said, and there was something in his tone that she did not like. "Mr. Colton, yes," she said steadily. "Clara, you know nothing about this man. He appeared out of nowhere." "I know a great deal about him," she said. "I have spent a considerable amount of time in his company." She rose, which was a clear indication that the conversation was concluded. "I am grateful for your regard, Harlan, and I wish you well, but my answer is no." He left, not angry exactly, but with the deflated look of a man who had been genuinely certain he was going to win and had not. She felt sorry for his disappointment and not a moment's doubt about her decision. She told Jessie about it that evening because she was not a person who kept things from people she trusted, and she watched his jaw tighten slightly and then consciously release. "Did he upset you?" Jessie asked. "He annoyed me a little," she said honestly. "But no. He is harmless. He simply does not hear no the first time." Jessie looked at her for a moment. "If he bothers you again, I would like to know," he said, not in a threatening way but in the way of a man who wanted to be useful to the person he cared about. "I will tell you," she said, "though I think he has heard it clearly enough now." Harlan Weeks did not bother her again, and the matter closed itself. December came, and the temperatures dropped to serious cold, and the plains wind had an edge to it that cut through even good wool. Jessie's house was finished and habitable, warm from the stone fireplace he had built with deliberate care, and Clara came to supper there for the first time and stood in the doorway of the main room looking at what he had made and felt something large and quiet move through her. It was a good house, simple and solid and honest, built to last, built for someone who intended to stay. The fire was going in the hearth and the oil lamps threw warm pools of light, and Jessie had made an effort that was evident and touching. A clean cloth on the table, the good dishes he had hauled from Abilene, the pot on the stove from which something smelled extraordinary. "You can cook," she said, more surprised than she should have been. "I have been cooking for myself for years," he said, in the aggrieved tone of a man whose competence has been doubted. "A man who cannot cook is a man who goes hungry." "I retract my surprise," she said solemnly and sat down. The dinner was good, genuinely good, and they ate slowly and talked easily, and after the meal they sat by the fire and she fell asleep briefly against her own will, exhausted from the day's work, and woke to find a blanket had been placed over her, and Jessie was sitting across the fire reading, making no effort to wake her. She sat up and he looked over with an expression of such uncomplicated warmth that she felt the full weight of all the months between his arrival bleeding on her porch and this moment settle into meaning. "You should have woken me," she said. "You were tired," he said simply. She looked at him across the fire, this man who had appeared in her life without warning and had, with remarkable quietness and steadiness, become essential to it. "Jessie," she said. He put down his book. "I love you," she said. Because she was a practical woman and did not see any particular virtue in delaying clear truths once they were fully known. The firelight moved over his face and she watched him receive those words, the way his expression moved from stillness through something that looked almost like pain, the pain of wanting something so much that having it was nearly too large to hold. He came across the room and sat beside her on the bench and took her face in his hands, calloused, careful hands, and looked at her, as though he was memorizing the details of her. "I have loved you," he said, "since the morning I woke up and you were sitting at that table with your coffee looking at me like you were sizing up the nature of the problem and were fairly confident you could solve it." She laughed and he laughed, and then he kissed her, a different kiss from the one at the gate in September. This one was deeper and more certain, the kiss of two people who were not testing the water any longer but had both decided to swim. The winter of 1882 into 1883 passed with the particular sweetness of two people who are newly in love during a season that keeps the rest of the world mostly indoors. They spent their evenings between their two homes, Clara teaching Jessie the rhythms of the local ranching community, Jessie teaching Clara the cattle management techniques he had refined over 8 years in Abilene. The knowledge exchange was practical and entirely genuine, and also deeply intimate in the way that sharing expertise with someone you trust always is. In January, he asked her to marry him. He did not make a great production of it. They were walking the fence line between their properties in the late afternoon, the pale winter sun low over the hills, when he stopped and turned to her and said, with the directness that she had loved about him from the beginning, "I want you to be my wife, Clara. I want to spend my life with you, and I want to build something here that is ours, not mine and the place next door, but ours together, if you will have me." Clara stood in the cold, clear air of a January afternoon in Texas and felt the full alignment of what her life had become and what it was becoming, the past with all its grief and the present with all its unexpected grace. And she looked at this steady, good man who had arrived bleeding on her porch and had become the person she trusted most in the world. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He picked her up off the ground, which she had not anticipated, and she laughed in surprise, and he set her back down and kissed her in the cold air with both of them smiling too much for it to be done properly. And then they went back to her house, and she made coffee, and they sat at the table where she had first assessed him as a problem to be solved, and began to talk about the future. They married in March of 1883, in the small white church in Colton Creek, on a day when the bluebonnets were just beginning to come up in the fields, and the air smelled of rain and fresh grass. The ceremony was simple and attended by most of the town, which was the privilege of people who had lived in a place long enough to become genuinely known to it. Mabel Hartley cried, which everyone had expected. Doc Abernathy stood up for Jessie, having appointed himself an unofficial friend of the groom in the months since Jessie had been brought in to have the stitches looked at. Clara's two closest friends, Ada Walsh and Patience Garvey, flanked her with the quiet solidarity of women who had seen her through grief and solitude, and were now seeing her through joy. When Jessie took her hand at the altar, Clara felt the full circle of it, the way that life sometimes turned back on itself and offered you something you had given up hoping for, and she held his hand and made her promises with a steady voice that carried everything she meant. The reception was held at the town meeting hall, pushed-back tables and fiddle music, and food enough for twice the number of people present, because that was how Colton Creek did things, abundantly and without apology. Clara danced with her husband until her feet ached, and then danced some more. On their way home in the wagon under the broad Texas stars, she sat close beside him with her head against his shoulder, and the night air cool and sweet around them. "Husband," she said, trying the word. "Wife," he said back, with a warmth in his voice she felt all the way through. They settled into the life of married people on neighboring land that was becoming one holding, making decisions together about the cattle and the planting and the gradual expansion of what Jessie had started building the previous fall. Clara kept her homestead active, the chickens and the kitchen garden and the careful running of the household, while also becoming a full partner in the ranch business, which suited her entirely. The town had opinions about the manner of their partnership, because it was more equal than was typical for the time, with Clara participating openly in the business decisions and the physical work of the ranch. Some found this peculiar. Most found it admirable. A few of the older men in the community had muttered early on about a woman's place, and had been roundly ignored by both Clara and Jessie, who were too busy building something real to spend time on the opinions of people who were not helping. In the summer of 1883, Clara discovered she was expecting a child, and the news settled over both of them like a warm and serious light. Jessie's response was to stand very still for a moment and then pull her into an embrace that said everything. His voice was apparently too overwhelmed to manage for the moment. She felt him press his face against her hair and breathe, and when he finally released her, his eyes were bright. "Are you happy?" she asked, though she was fairly certain she knew. "Clara," he said, "I am more happy than I have any adequate words for." She laughed and pressed her hands to his chest. "Good," she said, "because I am going to need you to fix the window in the second room before November." He fixed the window and then built a proper cradle from the cedar wood he had saved from clearing the building site, working on it in the evenings with a focus and care that she watched from the doorway sometimes, the lamplight on his bent head, his hands moving slowly over the wood. The pregnancy was not easy. In the 4th month, Clara had a frightening week of illness that put Doc Abernathy on a daily visiting schedule and frightened Jessie with a thoroughness that he was not entirely able to hide from her. He sat by her bed through most of it, doing the things she had done for him in the first days of their acquaintance, bringing water and clean cloths and quiet, steady presence. "You are not allowed to be ill," he told her, in a voice that was trying to be light and was not quite making it. "I will inform my body of your preferences," she said from beneath the quilts. "I am serious, Clara." "I know you are," she said, and reached out and found his hand and held it. She came through the illness, and the pregnancy continued without further serious incident. Jessie became increasingly attentive in ways that sometimes amused her and sometimes moved her deeply, leaving the easier tasks for her without making it obvious, driving the wagon when she would have ridden, walking the longer way around to avoid the rough ground without commenting on why. She noticed all of it and said nothing except in her eyes, which she knew told him everything anyway. Their son was born in November of 1883, a large, healthy, extremely emphatic boy whom they named Thomas after Clara's first husband and Henry after Jessie's father, and who arrived in the world with the apparent intention of making his presence felt, which he accomplished with considerable success. Jessie held him in the first minutes after birth, Doc Abernathy having handed him over with the particular satisfaction of a man who had delivered a good many babies in his career, and the expression on Jessie's face as he held his son was something Clara would keep in her memory and return to for the rest of her life. It was the face of a man receiving something he had not entirely believed he would have, something enormous and precarious, and absolutely worth every frightening inch of wanting it. "Thomas Henry Colton," Jessie said softly, to the baby who was examining his new surroundings with a skeptical squint. "Welcome to Colton Creek." Tom, as he was called almost immediately, was a robust and cheerful child who grew with the particular speed of frontier children, and seemed determined to touch, taste, climb, and investigate everything within reach from the earliest possible age. He was dark-haired like both his parents and had Jessie's eyes and Clara's stubborn chin, and both of them saw in him traces of themselves that they noted with the private delight of parents everywhere. The ranch grew through 1884 and into 1885, Jessie taking on 2 hired hands, brothers named Julio and Miguel Vargas, who had come up from further south seeking work, and who proved to be invaluable, skilled with cattle and horses, and as hardworking as anyone Jessie had ever employed. Clara treated them with the direct and practical courtesy she gave everyone, and was pleased to see that they were reliable men of good character, which was not always a given in the hiring-out economy of the frontier. Julio Vargas, the younger brother, had a wife and 2 children back home whom he was saving to bring north, and Clara found occasion to help him write the letters when his own written English was not adequate to say what he wanted, and the gratitude in his face at these small services was something she found more rewarding than she could easily explain. There were difficulties, as there always were. A dry summer in 1885 that required careful water management and harder choices about the size of the herd. A dispute with a cattleman to the north whose stock kept breaking through the fence line, which was eventually resolved through a direct and not entirely comfortable conversation between Jesse and the man in question. A conversation Clara had prepared Jesse for by pointing out very precisely what the law said and what leverage they actually had. The fence was repaired and the dispute concluded, and Jesse came home from it with the slightly surprised expression of a man whose wife had given him better legal and tactical advice than the lawyer in town might have. "You should have been an attorney," he said. "I should have been several things," she said. "I ended up a rancher's wife, and I find it suits me well enough." In the spring of 1886, Clara learned she was expecting again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body more accustomed to the process, and she carried it with less trouble and more confidence. Tom was 2.5 now, old enough to follow his father around the ranch with the absolute seriousness of a child who considers himself to be a working participant, which Jesse encouraged with a patience and warmth that made Clara love him in a new dimension entirely. She watched them together, the tall man and the small boy, walking the fence line in the evening with Tom's small hand in Jesse's large one, and felt a fullness of heart that she had not known she was capable of in the years when she had been alone here. Their daughter was born in October of 1886, a smaller, quieter child than her brother, born at dawn on a clear fall morning when the air through the open window smelled of autumn grass and wood smoke. They named her Anna Ruth, Anna for no particular reason except that it had seemed right, and Ruth for Clara's mother, gone since Clara was 12 but remembered always. Anna was a child of enormous brown eyes and close observation, content to sit and watch the world before engaging with it, as different from her boisterous brother as it was possible to be, and both her parents found in her particular qualities entirely her own that delighted them. Jesse was magnificent with both of them, in the straightforward, practical, affectionate way that was native to his character. He was not the kind of father who performed for an audience, but the kind who simply showed up, consistently and fully, who was present for the ordinary moments, and did not save himself for the extraordinary ones. Clara watched this and felt grateful in ways she did not often find words for. By 1887, the Colton Ranch was a genuine going concern, 120 head of cattle, good grass, a reliable water supply from the creek, and a reputation among the cattle buyers from Abilene as a source of quality beef. Jesse had made a name for himself in the local ranching community, not through boasting or aggression, but through consistent reliability and fair dealing, which in the long run built more goodwill than anything else. Clara's original homestead had been formally incorporated into the ranch in the legal paperwork, though the house remained her particular domain, the kitchen garden still thriving, the elm tree she had planted for her father now a proper tree that gave good shade to the east side of the house in summer afternoons. She sometimes sat under it in the evenings with the children and thought about her father, who would have loved Jesse, she was certain of it, and who would have been so pleased to see what she had made of the life he had started for her here. The town of Colton Creek grew through these years, as the country around it grew. The railroad reached closer every year, and the economic activity that followed it brought new businesses and new settlers. Clara watched the changes with a mixture of welcome and protectiveness, wanting the prosperity, but alert to the ways in which growth changed the character of a place, and not all of those ways were good. She became involved in the effort to establish a proper school, the closest schoolhouse being 3 miles out, and the building increasingly inadequate for the number of children in the area. She organized, cajoled, raised money, and wrote letters with a persistence that eventually resulted in a new school building being approved and funded, which she took considerable satisfaction in, thinking of her father and his wagon full of books, and his absolute conviction that education was the foundation of everything worth having. Jesse supported all of this with his characteristic blend of practical help and confidence in her abilities, showing up to help with the fundraising dinner, lending the ranch wagon for hauling building materials, and staying out of the way of the organizational work, which he recognized was hers in the way the cattle management was his. In the summer of 1888, on an evening in late July when the heat was beginning to break toward evening and the kids were both asleep in the house, they sat on the porch together as they had done so many hundreds of times by now. This porch that was not her original porch but the new one on the house they had made together, larger than her original, with a view of the oaks and the glint of the creek in the distance. She was leaning against his shoulder and his arm was around her, a posture that had become so natural over the years that it was like breathing, something they fell into without thought. "Do you remember the first night?" she asked. "The storm," he said. "Yes. I remember not being entirely sure whether I was going to stay conscious long enough to tell you my name." "J. Colton," she said. "That is all your saddlebag told me. And what did you make of J. Colton?" "I made that he was going to be a great deal of work," she said, and felt him laugh, the particular movement of it that she knew through years of being held close to him. "You were correct," he said. She was quiet for a moment, watching the fireflies beginning their evening signals in the long grass below the porch. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" "About Tom's schooling," she said. "He is nearly 5. He will be ready soon and the school is good now. But he should have proper books at home as well." "Whatever he needs," Jessie said immediately. "My father's books are still there," she said. "I want him to have them." Jessie was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have liked that," he said. "He would have insisted on it," she said. She paused. "He would have liked you very much." Jessie's arm tightened around her, a small, private thing. "I would have liked to meet him," he said. "From everything you have told me, he was a remarkable man." "He was ordinary in most ways," she said. "He was just very fully himself. He did not pretend to be something he was not, and he did not hide from things that needed doing." She looked out at the darkening land, the land that had been her father's hope and her grief and her survival, and was now her home in the fullest sense. "You remind me of him sometimes." Jessie looked down at her, and in the last light she could see his face, the familiar angles of it, the gray that had come into his hair in the last year or two, the lines at the corners of his eyes that were the record of years of sun and laughter and serious thought. He was 36 now and she was 32, and they had 6 years of marriage and everything those years contained. And he was looking at her with an expression she had seen in 100 variations but never stopped finding remarkable, the expression of a man who could not believe his good fortune and was not ashamed to show it. "That," he said quietly, "is the finest thing anyone has ever said to me." She reached up and touched his face, the habitual intimacy of long marriage, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm for a moment, and they sat together as the stars came out over Texas, and the fireflies pulsed in the grass, and inside the house their 2 children were sleeping, small and safe and dreaming whatever children dreamed, and everything that Clara had built and survived and rebuilt and been given was gathered here in this hour and this place. The years that followed were years of growing abundance, not in the extravagant sense, but in the way of a well-tended farm, steady and increasing. Tom started school in the fall of 1888 and proved to have his grandfather's love of books combined with his father's practical intelligence, devouring everything he could get his hands on, and then wanting to discuss it at supper. Anna followed him to school 2 years later, and was the kind of student who made her teachers feel as though they were the lucky ones, watching everything with those enormous brown eyes, and then surprising everyone by having absorbed twice what anyone had realized. Julio Vargas finally brought his family up from the south in 1889, his wife Esperanza and his children, and Clara welcomed them with the practical warmth that was her nature, helping Esperanza find her footing in the community, which was not always welcoming of Mexican families in the way it should have been. Clara was direct and unapologetic about this, inviting the Vargas family to the community functions, introducing them as valued members of the ranch family, and making it plain by her own behavior what she expected from the people around her. Jessie backed her in all of it without reservation, understanding as she did that the West had been built on the labor of people who were not always given credit for it. There were those in Colton Creek who felt differently, who harbored the prejudices of the era with the stubbornness of people who found the world changing faster than they wished. Clara did not have time for this and said so, in the measured but entirely unambiguous way she had of saying things she was certain of. It was not a popular stance with everyone, but Clara had never particularly organized her life around popularity, and Jessie, watching her, found that he loved this quality in her as much as any other she possessed. In the spring of 1890, Clara found out she was expecting a third child, which was a surprise at 34 but not an unwelcome one. Tom was 6 and Anna was 3.5, and the household, which had always been full of work and voice, and the general energetic noise of a functional family, became more so. Jesse's response to this news was a quieter version of his response to the first two, the same profound gladness under better self-control now, though she could see it clearly enough to know it. He made the same practical preparations, the room adjustments and the cradle refinishing, and the extra considerations for her comfort that he undertook without announcing, which she had come to know as his primary love language, the language of doing rather than declaring. "Are you hoping for a particular kind?" she asked him one evening, because 3 times was enough to establish a pattern and she was curious. "I am hoping for a healthy child," he said, with perfect sincerity. "You could want one or the other," she said, pressing. "I want what you have," he said. "That is my sincere and entire answer." The third child was a boy, born in December of 1890, whom they named James after no one in particular, but because it suited him, with the optional nickname of Jimmy, which he would grow to absolutely insist upon within a few years of being able to express preferences. Jimmy was, from the first, a combination of both his parents' qualities in ways that seemed almost intentional, with Clara's directness and Jesse's calm, and an additional character element that appeared to be entirely his own, a gift for making people laugh that was evident from infancy. Christmas of 1890, with 3 children and a working ranch and the whole community around them, was the kind of holiday that Clara would describe in later years as one of the best of her life. The house was full and warm. Ada and Patience came with their own families. The Vargas family came. Doc Abernathy, who had by now become genuinely a family friend, came with his wife. And Jesse had quietly arranged for a musician to come from town, and there was dancing again, as there had been that first evening on his land when the lumber smell was all around them, and she had placed her hand in his for the first time. She caught his eye across the room during one of the quieter moments, when the children were occupied and the conversation hummed around them, and he looked back at her with that expression she had loved from the beginning, the one that said, without any words at all, that she was the center of everything he considered worth having. She raised her cup toward him, a small private toast, and he returned it with the gravity of a man who understood what was being acknowledged, which was all of it. The storm and the blood and the careful stitching and the weeks of recovery and the fence line and the lumber smell and the dancing and the proposals and the promises and the children and the years. All of it gathered into this warm room in December of 1890 in a small town in Texas, where neither of them had been born, but both of them had chosen. The new year came in cold and clear, 1891, stretching ahead of them with the particular quality of a future that had been built carefully enough to be trusted. The ranch was sound. The children were healthy. The land that had once been a widow's homestead and a stranger's recent purchase was now a single holding with deep roots in the red Texas earth. Clara stood at her kitchen window one morning in January, the kitchen that was in the original house, her house, the one she had held onto through grief and difficulty and all the years of alone, and she looked out at the elm tree that was now a proper big tree, its bare winter branches against the pale sky, her father's tree, her grief tree, her memorial, and she thought about what he had told her once when she was young and afraid, that the best thing you could do with loss was keep living and keep building. Because that was the only honest tribute to the people who had wanted good things for you and had not been able to stay. She heard Jesse's voice from outside, talking to Tom, who was following him on the morning rounds as he had done since he was barely walking, and she heard Tom's answering high voice and then Jesse's laugh, and then she heard the baby, Jimmy, beginning to make the declarative sounds of a small person who had determined it was time for breakfast. Anna appeared in the kitchen doorway still in her nightgown, her dark hair in the disarray of mourning, looking at her mother with those wide, attentive eyes. "Is Papa coming in soon?" she asked. "In a little while," Clara said. "Are you hungry?" Anna considered this with her characteristic seriousness. "Yes," she decided. "Can we have the cornbread?" "We can have the cornbread," Clara said, and turned from the window to make breakfast for her family, in this kitchen, in this house, on this land that she had held and that had, in the end, given back so much more than she had put into it. Jesse came in with Tom behind him, both of them dusting off boots at the door with the disciplined habit Clara had instilled early and maintained firmly, and Jesse looked up and found her eyes across the kitchen, and the particular look passed between them, the quick, certain, domestic look of two people who have made something real together and know it, and are grateful for it in the ordinary, daily, ongoing way that is the deepest kind of gratitude there is. "Cornbread," Tom announced with satisfaction, having already assessed the situation. "Indeed," Clara said. Jesse came to the stove and stood beside her for a moment close, and pressed his lips briefly to her hair, and she felt the warmth of him and the familiar comfort of his presence as she would have felt the warmth of the kitchen fire, as something that was simply part of the constitution of home. "Good morning," he said quietly for her. "Good morning," she said back. The baby declared himself louder from the next room, and Tom offered to go get him, and Jesse said he would, and Clara said it was fine she would since she was nearest, and all three of them started for the door at once, and then stopped and looked at each other. And the small ridiculous comedy of a household with too many willing hands made them all laugh, which woke the baby further and brought Anna to see what was funny. Outside, the elm tree stood in the winter light, bare and patient, waiting for spring. The cattle were in the field and the smoke was rising from both chimneys, the old house and the new house, and the fence line between what had once been two separate parcels was still there, because some structures were useful to maintain, but it had two gates in it now, both of them always open. The land rolled out to the south toward the creek and the oaks, and the sky above it was the enormous, indifferent, beautiful Texas sky that looked down on everything with equal impartiality, on the struggles and the joys and the daily ordinary moments that were, Clara had long since understood, the substance of a life well lived. She had nursed a stranger back to health on a stormy night, not knowing anything about him beyond the fact that he needed help, and she had the ability to provide it. She had not known about the land next door. She had not known about any of the things that would unfold from that single act of simple human decency. But she had learned in the years since that the most significant things rarely announced themselves as such. They arrived like storms, unscheduled and urgent, asking you to respond with whatever you had. And if you responded fully and honestly, if you stitched carefully and kept watch and told the truth and opened the gates, then what grew from it could be something that made the whole difficult business of living feel not just bearable but genuinely, abundantly worth the work. Clara Beaumont Colton was 35 years old in January of 1891, standing in the kitchen of the house she had built with her hands and held with her stubbornness and shared with her love. And she was, in the full and honest reckoning of the word, happy. She picked up the baby, who immediately grabbed a fistful of her hair and regarded her with the absolute imperious confidence of the very young, and she laughed and kissed his round cheek and felt the morning open around her, ordinary and golden and entirely, completely enough.